Without further ado, I will now get on to our list of speakers. And our first session is Out to Defeat Ford and Contend with the NDP and Labour Bureaucracy. And our speakers, and they will be in the order that I read out now. Our first speaker is Comrade Julius Arscott. Julius works for the Ministry of Environment and is an executive board member of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. He is an organizer of Workers' Action Movement and a leader of Socialist Action Canada. Our second speaker is Dirka Prout. She is a past president of London West NDP Federal and Provincial Riding Association, currently the co-chair of the Federal NDP Women's Caucus. Dirka writes for the Socialist Caucus Turn Left magazine and was an SC candidate, a Socialist Caucus, for NDP Federal Executive in 2018. She's a geotechnical engineer who organizes spelling bees in her spare time. Wow. Dirka was a 2017 recipient of an Ontario Leading Women's Leading Girls Award. And our third speaker is Pam Frache. So you got it wrong too. Is the provincial coordinator of the $15 and Fairness campaign. She has worked for the Ontario Federation of Labour and is a leading member of the International Socialists. Euridice Baumgarten is a native of Brazil who has been working in Toronto for social justice for decades. She is a tenant community worker with the Federation of Metro Tenants Association. Barry Weisleder is a retired teacher, a union organizer, and chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus. He is a co-editor of Socialist Action newspaper and the author of several booklets, including The Power and Dilemma of Trade Unions, Prospects for Socialism in Canada, and Cannon's Concept of the Revolutionary Party. Barry is the Federal Secretary of Socialist Action Canada. So, without further ado, comrades, you have up to 15 minutes, and because we have a large panel of 5, and we want to have time for questions, I will keep each and every one of you strictly to the 15 minutes.
Can you hear me? Is this thing working, or can you hear it? Can you hear it? It literally isn't working.
You're fine.
Can you hear me without it?
Yeah.
Speak loud enough, Julius.
Okay. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
First, I want to welcome everyone to this weekend's Education for Activists conference. I'm sure it will inspire you to get more involved. We live in strange and frightening times. From the ecological crisis to the rise of the far right, we see right-wing populists and near-fascist leaders elected around the world, from Brazil to Poland. Even in Ontario, we saw a right populist challenger to the status quo in the Ontario PC party become leader, mimicking the politics we see south of the border. If Doug Ford gets his way, he will make Mike Harris seem timid. Ford was quick to come out against monitoring police for racist abuse and to resume carding. He cut pro-Indigenous materials from school curricula. He reverted to an outdated sex education, broke the strike of QP Local 3903 workers at York University, declared a freeze of hiring for the public sector, created a snitch line to target teachers. He tabled the Open for Business law to repeal Bill 148, signaled a free speech law to protect white supremacists and the circulation of racist, far-right propaganda on college campuses. Ford is abruptly phasing out the basic income pilot project, leaving many poor people in immediate financial peril. He reduced social assistance increases to make a bad situation worse. He ended public investment in green energy and removed the carbon tax without any plan to curb greenhouse gases. Ford says he's eager to drive the bulldozer to carve mineral resources out of the Ring of Fire landscape in Northern Ontario without consent from Indigenous peoples. Ford cut Toronto City Council nearly in half and made it clear that he'd overwrite any court ruling that stood in his way. It resulted in a 20% lower voter turnout, less representation from minority and marginalized people, and conservative centralization and control at City Hall. Following the election, he canceled planned funding of 3 post-secondary campuses in Brampton, Milton, and Markham. So what response have you seen so far from the labor movement? Well, not a whole lot. Before the Ontario election, the Ontario Federation of Labour Convention passed a motion that the OFL would call on affiliates to vote for and work to elect the NDP and NDP government. This issue was fought over and won twice during the convention, after some affiliates, including Unifor, attempted to block it. OPSEU, CUPE, and other unions fought to support the NDP. This was a first for OPSEU, but things quickly changed as the election drew near. OPSEU did not explicitly call on its members to vote for the NDP until a week before the election date. Instead, it launched a campaign to encourage its members simply to vote, like a public service announcement. The union tops refused to endorse a specific party, claiming that the union is non-partisan and could not make such an endorsement, even though they engaged in a pitched battle with Unifor over this very issue at the OFL convention. The contradictions don't stop there. When the writ was dropped at Queen's Park, Chris Buckley, who's the president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, told reporters at a media scrum that the Federation would not call on affiliates to vote for any specific party, completely contradicting the will of the majority of delegates at the OFL convention. He later corrected his position and urged in support for a vote for the NDP. So we all know the Conservatives won a majority government, but the NDP ran a much more, it should be noted that the NDP ran a much more progressive campaign than they have in recent memory. Campaign promises included, and many of them were actually built on the momentum and victories of the Fight for 15 campaign, as well as long-standing efforts of the NDP Socialist Caucus. And some of these policies included free post-secondary education and reducing student debt by converting loans to grants and creating thousands of student jobs, pharmacare and dental care for all, additional minimum vacation days, cutting hydro bills by 30% by bringing Hydro Ontario back into the public hands, and last but not least, they want to pay for this by taxing the rich. These policies won the party official opposition status. And it's one more example of why, in order to survive, the NDP must shift to the left. But the NDP and the working class really did need all hands on deck in this election, and the Labour movement should have responded accordingly. Since the election, some NDP MPPs stressed the need to speak out in the legislature, but to focus on the next election in 4 years. But we say no, we can't wait, we must organize to fight back now. The response from the Labour movement since the election of Ford has not been good. While some unions, including LIUNA and the power workers, actually expressed support for Doug Ford, the OFL has yet to call for an organized response to the attacks on workers in this province. At a Heads of Union meeting on June 27th, there were references to the days of action against Mike Harris, coupled with disparaging comments. Some bureaucrats said that those actions were in the past, and we cannot rely on that kind of action today. Instead, the Labour movement should try to slow down the Ford agenda with red tape, because a head-on conflict with Ford would only fuel his base, according to these wise men. Labour is the biggest threat to the Ford agenda, but the total lack of willingness by the leadership demonstrates the need for an organized body of Labour militants to challenge the status quo in our movement. The Workers' Action movement arose out of the campaign to elect Hassan Husseini president of the CLC several years ago. WAM began with a small group of activists who came out of the People's Summit in Ottawa and was relaunched in 2017. WAM focuses on the need to oppose concessions bargaining, fight for democracy within our unions, and fight for a workers' government. We run candidates in elections and openly challenge the leadership of our unions. We are internationalists and support the struggles of all oppressed peoples. Recently, we have promoted Palestine solidarity, and we played a role in the adoption of a motion at the CLC convention supporting Palestinian hunger strikers, which was a historic win for the Labour movement. WAM stresses the need to fight concessions bargaining against two-tier bargaining, which serves only to divide labor and alienate young workers. It is designed to maximize profits for the bosses by paying new hires less for doing the same work as workers who have been employed longer. It is a betrayal of young and new workers who often enter the workforce burdened with huge debts from post-secondary education, and they often also have to contend with the massive rise in cost of living, and we certainly see that in this city. Democracy is also under threat in our movements. Activists are encouraged to refrain from criticizing the leadership, as they may jeopardize book-off opportunities or even full-time well-paying jobs within unions. The leadership is willing to defy the labor movement by attacking or raiding other unions, but it will not tolerate dissent aimed towards its own leadership. A case in point is Barry Weisleder, who after spending years organizing substitute teachers and building an active democratic union was removed from office on trumped-up charges. He continued to fight for the interests of teachers, forming the Substitute Teachers Action Caucus and campaigning to restore rank-and-file control. Barry was banned from participating in his union meeting for 10 years, just for asking a question about job security and insisting on an answer. After being barred, he was physically assaulted by hired security goons, by OSS at an OSSTF meeting while he was distributing leaflets. Another example is my own. Several years ago, when my division, the Ontario Public Service, wasn't bargaining, I published a leaflet encouraging our members not to vote for the deal because it was concessionary, and the union called security, which called the police, and I was escorted out of my own ratification vote, even though I was an elected president of my local, and I had a full mandate to be there by the members of my local. I'm happy to say, though, that the members of my local rejected that offer, as well as a subsequent rollover agreement. So WAM participates in rallies and hosts meetings and conferences. During major conventions, we host meetings of labor activists to critique the status quo. We have participated in Fight for 15 and Fairness demonstrations and other actions, and we regularly participate in anti-fascist actions in this city. We acknowledge the importance of building the kind of unions which the working class deserves. Unions that challenge capitalism, unions that organize the unorganized, that support the NDP as a labor party, but push it radically to the left. A movement which works in solidarity with other movements and that champions equity. A movement that will go to the wall for the working class. We are fully aware that the rise of the far right is a result of the complete inadequacies of liberal and social democratic versions of capitalism. If we don't present a fundamental alternative, capital will drive through us like a hot knife through butter. Remember, 40% of unionized workers voted for Doug Ford. And in this city, 20,000 people voted for Faith Goldie, a white supremacist. So the threat of disaster is real. We run candidates for office, whether it be local steward, local president, executive board member, or even union president. We treat these elections as opportunities to challenge the status quo. In some cases, we even get elected. In fact, I was elected to the OPSEU Executive Board in 2017 on the platform which I have outlined. I won on the first round of ballots cast and received the second highest vote in the largest region in the province. It's no small feat for sure, and it demonstrates the interests of the rank and file to socialist ideas. Most recently, the work of WAM has centered on a motion for an emergency OFL convention. This motion has been endorsed by several OPSEU locals, several NDP electoral district associations, as well as the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, the largest and oldest labour council in Canada. An overwhelming majority of delegates supported the motion on the October 1st meeting. It's no surprise that we often run into hurdles in our efforts by the leadership. An attempt was made to replace the motion which I submitted to Labour Council with a weaker motion simply calling for regional activist meetings alone. And of course, we argued for both and supported both motions. And support for the motion continues to grow. We ask everyone at this conference, I've actually handed it out, you can just take a look, it looks like this, to bring it back with you. If you're in a union, get your union local to endorse, or any community organizations you might be part of, anybody, get it endorsed and sent off to the OFL. A convention would send a strong message to the Doug Ford and Bay Street that the labor movement is on the move. We are prepared for war, and we will shut this province down if necessary. An emergency convention could occur in a single day. It can happen in several different locations. It can be telecast so that it happens at different locations all at once to save money. We know that we cannot rely on the courts to stop and reverse Doug Ford's Bay Street agenda. Ford initially announced his plans to reduce the size of Toronto City Council in late July. On September the 10th, Justice Edward Belobaba ruled against Ford's proposed Bill 5 an act that would cut the number of Toronto City Councillors from 47 to 25, due to it being unconstitutional and infringing on candidates and voters' rights of freedom of expression as outlined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In response, Ford said that he would not accept that ruling and planned to invoke the notwithstanding clause, a legal loophole that allows federal and provincial leaders to enact laws that go against sections of the Charter. Essentially, it allows political leaders to not follow legislation that they don't agree with. Before Ford's latest actions, this clause has never been used in the province of Ontario. On September the 19th, Ontario's appeal court sided with the Ford government with its 3-judge panel, noting in its decision that unfairness alone does not establish a charter breach. This example demonstrates that the workers' movement cannot rely on the boss's courts to defend our self-interests. Ford made it clear that he would use the notwithstanding clause whenever he felt the need. Only mass action can take down Doug Ford. We must build towards the general strike, the days of action, and fight for a workers' government. But to challenge the agenda of big business and the status quo, we must challenge the direction of the labor movement. This task starts with us right now. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. December the 11th, 1995, London, Ontario, where I live. Population 300,000. The weather records indicated a high of minus 12.8 degrees Celsius with a wind chill of minus 40 degrees Celsius. In defiance of the chilling physical and political atmosphere, a mass of 15,000 people walked chanting, "It's not as cold as Harris," in reference to the then Conservative Premier Mike Harris. In an event that exceeded expectations, a reported 2/3 of 40,000 of London's 60,000 unionized workforce walked off the job. The December 1995 Day of Action kicked off almost 3 years of robust and sustained fights against conservative attacks on poor and workers. Similar actions are needed today to fight for its agenda. However, strikes do not arise spontaneously. They need to be fired up from the grassroots and supported by Labour and the NDP. In my opening remarks, I noted that London's Day of Action exceeded expectations. The London District and Labour Council was astonished at being selected for the first official Day of Action after a proposed November 14, 1995 strike in Oshawa had suddenly been called off by the OFL. In the words of Kellogg, I'm thinking of cereal, in his paper Workers versus Austerity, striking Oshawa, quote, striking Oshawa at the heart of the Canadian economy would have sent a quick message to the Conservatives that the movement was serious. It would have galvanized hundreds of thousands in Ontario and in other provinces, that a fight back was on the cards and a serious fight back. No one could question the power of the workers of Oshawa. That city, along with Winnipeg, Windsor, Sept-Îles, and a few other places, is iconic in Canada as a location of historic working class militancy. London, more of an unknown quantity. Unquote. Currently, the ONDP is seeking to establish a unity fund that will pay for organizers and training to defeat Ford. This is a laudable goal. Direct action is the most powerful tool of the oppressed and poor. Sometimes it's the only tool. Direct actions is cited by most experienced activists as the most effective way to get change and empower the masses. The labor union, on the other hand, has a long history of advocating for people's rights, and not just workers, general people as well. It's got a lot of experienced negotiators and a lot of experienced, skilled activists. It has national and international reach. And with Labour and the NDP combined, that will be a powerful tool for empowering the masses, because we have to remember, even though in reality, legislative political change is happening at the level of elected officials, the legitimacy of the NDP, which is our Labour/Socialist party, must take the cue from the citizens. Power must flow from the bottom and flow up to the top for the NDP to be legitimate. Coalition building is the basis of effective organizing. However, there are other building blocks. So the first one is long-term planning and grassroots infrastructure, the provision of hope, and constructing an alternative vision of the future, and that is very essential. These three areas will be discussed in the second part of my speech. Just one last note about coalition building before I move on. In 1995, during the first months of Harris's rule, the leadership of Labour was unresponsive and the NDP was impotent. It was the rank and file of the Labour Council of Metro Toronto, in concert with the Embarrass Mike Harris campaign, who organized the first rallies in September 1995. In fact, they engaged a broad-based coalition made up of unions, Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, and 17 busloads of union members from as far away as Sudbury and Ottawa. So let's examine the second building block of an effective resistance, which is having a long-term plan and building grassroots infrastructures. It is not enough to simply defeat Ford before the next election. Every activist organization, and I say everyone, should ask itself what it will take to achieve a goal that would leave a lasting legacy at the local, regional, or Ontario-wide level. One example of an activist group that was born during the days of action and is still around is People for Education. They are very active, media savvy, and report annually on the state of Ontario's public education. Having a long-term plan is important, since while the corporatist attack might periodically abate, they may come back in different forms. I am willing to bet that Harris, just like Harris, Ford will be successful in pissing off a lot of people. Their anger will compel them to move beyond signing petitions or clicktivism. They want to be transformed into activists. And while they might be energetic, they often don't come from the NDP or Labour. So they'll lack organizing skills and will be unaccustomed to direct confrontation. So that's why we need experienced activists from Labour and the NDP to go into communities and train future activists. Experienced activists need to support new ones who learn by doing. The third building block is providing hope. Seeing thousands of people in London protesting in the freezing cold gave Ontarians hope that they were not alone in their despair and that a new day was dawning. As activists, we have to bear in mind that hope inspires new activists, and it could also reinvigorate the fire in seasoned ones who are worn down by the relentless neoliberal struggle. Warn of perils of inaction if you must, but always infuse your messages with hope. Because it seems to me the value of hope seems to be underestimated. We won't get that from Ford. When dealing with persons who are new to activism, small victories are important for maintaining momentum and for teaching opportunities. As an organizer, always impart to your group FW, FW, FL, FH. And no, that is not a new curse word. It's an acronym for fight win, fight lose, fight harder. Beckwith and Lopez of the Center for Community Change gives an example of an organizer training a new community group. They suggest that even with simple issues such as adding a stop sign to an intersection that can easily be achieved with a phone call to a municipality, the organizer should insist on the group going through the motions just as if it was a bigger issue. They recommend that the organizer first get the group to hold a press conference at the street corner, march to City Hall and demand it, and negotiate with the traffic engineer over which tree it should be posted on. That way the group will learn how to work with each other and are better prepared for action on more demanding issues. practice makes perfect. Integral to the building block of hope is constructing an alternate vision of future possibilities. Through discourse from members from various and seemingly unrelated social movements, we can cross-pollinate ideas and offer the public a more uplifting future than the Ford propaganda machine could ever offer. To shut down Ford and the organized money people, we must empower the citizens and organize the people. For this, we need a map, what some activists call a movement action plan. Think of it as the anatomy of a direct action. So here I'm going to summarize in part from the Casino-Free Philadelphia Direct Action Manual. Fight. Stage 1. Business as usual. Few people care, and those who do small supportive groups and do small actions to get people thinking. Think about the little rallies and protests that pop up here and there by our friends, 15 and Fairness, London Common Front, and others. Stage 2. Win. Stage 2, failure of established channels. 15 to 20% of people will think there's a problem or injustice. Besides the government, established channels could include the NDP and Labour brass if they fail to do anything. Despite being challenged by groups formed in stage 1, they will fail to act or hum and haw. Lawsuits may arise, such as the one Julius spoke about.
5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. And large-scale action will not arise unless people lose their faith in established channels. Stage 3, ripening conditions, education and organizing. 20 to 30% of people think there's a problem or injustice. Well, things are warming up and more people are becoming interested. So now is the time for the movement to create more groups with a view to educate and counter the cons destructive narratives. For a successful fight, we have to do constant outreach, and formation of new groups is essential. Win. Stage 4. You take off. 40 to 60% of people think there's an injustice. The movement takes off because there's a sudden crisis or a trigger. The media and celebrities even take notice. Do not claim victory at this stage. You're only halfway through. An activist focus must be on continuing to build a grassroots movement and to get broad support. You must connect the demands of the movement with widely held values like fairness. You must continue to fight. Stage 5, lose. Perception of failure. Crowds shrink. The cons claim victory and start to forcefully repress you. The media disappears and even your dog doesn't want to be around you. Smart activists will take this in stride. Reflect on failures, plan corrective actions, lay out a strategic plan with measurable objectives, and celebrate those small wins. Even repression is a cause for celebration. Fight harder. Stage 6, win over that majority. By now it should be 60 to 70%. This is a transformative time. Your goal now is to get the majority of people on your side. Be prepared to do grassroots education and action with newbie people. Smart activists offer a clear, well-articulated alternative to the status quo. Stage 7, achieving alternative visions. This is a building stage and it could take months or even decades. Your goal now is to celebrate the success and empower activists to effect change within the framework of that new vision or paradigm. You'll have internal disagreements, but keep your eye on the end game. Look for more triggers because there are opportunity to win allies. Continue to fight. And the last stage is stage 8, consolidating and moving on. This is the mature stage. Protect and extend your gains. There will be the danger that institutions and governments who promised you change will fail to deliver. Keep your guard up and nurture spin-off movements in the same way the US 1960s civil rights movement was a guiding force for many others. So the building block of an effective resistance are coalition building. This is an ongoing process and is only effective from the bottom up and must be participated in fully by Labour and the NDP. Long-term planning and building grassroots infrastructure. You must have a map, a movement action plan. At each of the 8 stages in your map, you must educate and grow the movement. Provision of hope. Even celebrate small wins. Your map is a physical embodiment of hope. Be ready for that trigger or crisis at stages 4 and 8, because your careful planning and preparation is what will will prevent the same old, same old. And 4, constructing an alternative vision of the future. Stages 7 and 8 are the rewards of your hard work. Celebrate and have fun. Don't become complacent. Make sure institutions and elected officials truly adopt your progressive visions. Nurture any new movements created to tackle emerging or neglected injustices. Continue to fight. Building a resistance is about empowering people, not just to defeat forward, but to make a better future. We need to develop communities that are resilient to future attacks from the right. Power is multiplied by group action. So let's do a group thing. Could you say fight?
Fight.
Win.
Win.
Fight.
Fight.
Win.
Win.
Fight.
Fight.
Lose.
Lose.
Fight harder.
Fight harder.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for organizing this forum and for having this really important conversation. And I guess maybe I'll just share some of the things that I feel like I've learned through the fight for 15 and fairness, and see what you think about it. Generally, as Elizabeth said, I am a socialist, so I've always kind of subscribed to the notion that really all change is a question of the balance of class forces at any given moment. And I think certainly what I've appreciated most about the fight for 15 and fairness is being able to implement a vision of building a united multiracial working class movement that for which this particular campaign is but a phase of a much longer term vision of building real workers' power. So, and I think that frame in itself is an incredibly helpful frame, and one that I think sometimes our official labor leaders might benefit from, because I think that sometimes with the, even the most well-intentioned, leaders in the labor movement often have a bit of a fragmented approach to it, where it's one campaign, another campaign, another campaign, another campaign, but it's not clear how they relate to each other, it's not clear how they complement each other, it's not clear how we're building our forces, and very often all the work that goes into one particular campaign, when it's over, then we turn to something entirely different, and then we are actually literally not even figuratively starting from scratch, where we don't even seem to have the contact information of the people that we have just formally organized in one area. So to my mind, I think in some ways the task for the left, and this might be a bit controversial, and I'll just say I'm speaking for my own self, not for anybody else. But I think that we're at risk of looking for salvation from above. And by that I mean there's such a push to get the right people elected that nothing good can possibly happen unless we have precisely the right people elected in whether it's city council or whether it's in the provincial campaign or whether it's the federal campaign. And I think that gets translated into labor leaders as well, that there's this kind of fixation on the top of the labor movement where progressive forces spend an awful lot of time either trying to get exactly the right radical elected or denouncing the shortcomings or the perceived shortcomings of a given labor leader. And I think that the weakness in that perspective, however well-intentioned, is that it avoids the unglamorous, labor-intensive, grueling work of actually starting to talk to the people who are standing next to us, who are working beside us, who don't agree with everything we have to say at all times, and really just kind of focusing on people who already agree with us. And I was struck by your stat about 40% of union members voting for Ford. I hadn't heard that before. That's an astounding figure, but I think it tells us something about the work that we need to do at the grassroots levels. And I think, certainly some of our, our ruminations when in the Fight for 15 and Fairness campaign, maybe I'll back up by saying, part of what some of the tactical decisions that we made in the campaign emerged from our engagement with actual outreach and actually talking to ordinary people, for the last 2 weekends, I've spent it in Etobicoke North in Doug Ford's own riding and talking to people who voted for Doug Ford and asking them what they think about his labor law changes. But also in the lead up to the provincial election, we We painstakingly, talk to people. We have petitions, but not because we think petitions change the world, but because petitions are an excuse to talk to people, walk them through the issues, and it's an opportunity to find and activate new people. So we emphasize the invitation to join the campaign as the key thing about building and multiplying the activists and finding people who are active, inviting them to the next meeting, walking them through the arguments, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had this incredible like network of people across the province that when we were phoning them and kind of sounding the alarms around the provincial election campaign, we were shocked at the number of people who said, yes, I support a $15 minimum wage. Yes, I support paid sick days. I am with you every step of the way. I've been out petitioning with you. And that's why I'm voting for Doug Ford. And that is a wow. That is a very wow. And so then we say, well, when he was running for party leader, he was pretty clear that he didn't support the $15 minimum wage. And people are like, no, he supports the $15 minimum wage. And when we had posters up across the city that were outlining the different political party positions, some of our posters were defaced, not in the way you might think, but they crossed out, people were crossing out what we had said to, about the Conservative Party opposing 15 and fairness, and they crossed out and they said, support. And this was the way our posters were being defaced. That tells us something about class consciousness, I think, in the context of this campaign. And in one occasion when we were phoning, I didn't have this experience directly, but a woman who was helping us phone had the experience of talking to somebody on the phone, them saying, you're absolutely wrong, I completely support 15 and fairness, you're absolutely wrong, Doug Ford is the guy that's going to stand up and do all these things. And it just so happens that someone knocked on that person's door while this conversation on the phone was happening. So they stayed on the phone, they answered the door, it was a local Tory candidate. The person asked them on the doorstep, do you support a $15 minimum wage? And they flopped around and said, too much too soon, over a longer period of time, yes, we support it, but, and then this guy said, I'm asking you a direct question, do you support a $15 minimum wage to come into effect in January, like the law says? And then the guy had to say no, and then he said, I'm sorry, I'm not voting for anybody who doesn't support a $15 minimum wage, and closed the door, gets back on the phone and says, I would never have believed you in a million years if I had not had this experience. So that's an interesting thing. But let's unpack a little bit, because one thing that's interesting about the Tories right now, they're very anxious to say they were clear on rolling back the $15 minimum wage. And I submit to you that they were not at all clear on it. No. Ford was clear when he was running for leader of the Conservative Party, but after that, it disappeared from the lexicon, and all they talked about was tax cuts. And then one thing that was, and here I might be a little critical, but in any of the televised, how many of you watched the well, probably not all of you live in Ontario, so you might not, but for those of us who watch the televised leadership debates, when we know what's coming from Doug Ford, you would think that the leaders of the other parties would say something about and try to pull Ford out on the question of the minimum wage. Well, what happened? So the Liberals did not call Doug Ford out because of on the $15 minimum wage. Why? Because they knew as soon as they started talking about a $15 minimum wage, Andrea Horwath would be able to come in and say, how hypocritical of you defending $15 minimum wage when you have retained sub-minimum wage rates for students and liquor servers. So, of course, Kathleen Wynne doesn't want to open herself up to call out Doug Ford on that. So then you think to yourself, well, why would maybe Andrea Horwath, why would she not want to position herself as the champion for a $15 minimum wage? Well, polls told the NDP that the one thing that people may be hating on the Liberals, but the one thing that people really liked about the Liberals was what they did for labor law reform. And so guess what? That is not an NDP vote getter. And so as a consequence, there is no incentive for the NDP to campaign on those issues. And that's a real problem. That is a real problem because that's where there's a big contradiction between electoral politics and the needs of the working class. And even I will just say, and I did lots of panels, in the last several months, I found that people were far more concerned about whether or not workers were going to have illusions in the Liberals than they were about actually making sure that we continue to fight, that we continue to protect and enforce the gains that we had. And I want to just pause here because this fear the workers are going to be led down the garden path by a particular political party we know that no matter what, whatever capitalist boss's party is going to offer up in the form of a concession at one moment, if we stay mobilized, if we stay organized, if we still keep building working class power, eventually we're going to run into a roadblock. Of course, when ruling class parties are weak, they want to give concessions, et cetera, et cetera. Our job is to take advantage of those movements and drive that, Mack truck right through those splits in the ruling class and make sure that working class issues get addressed without hitching our wagon to any section of the ruling class. But I think that it's one of the biggest contradictions here, I think, is this notion that people were afraid that workers would be led down the garden path. And here's I want to give you an analogy. When unionized workers bargain a collective agreement and extract concessions from the boss, there is not ever one iota of worry that somehow workers are going to suddenly fall in love with the boss because the boss gave them a good contract, because we know that workers have to pull those concessions out of the bosses by hook or by tooth and nail, or whatever the expression is. But for some reason, when it comes to electoral politics, we lose all conception of class consciousness. Of course we know that and so anyway, so I think in some ways there's a lot of fixation on the top, and I think the real work has to be about activating networks. On the question of how our campaign operated, and we were grateful for the support and leadership that came from the Ontario Federation of Labour, and I'll just say right off, it's it depends on what we conceptualize as the Ontario Federation of Labour, because if ever we needed President Chris Buckley to speak an event, he was right there 110%. The staff, 110%, busting their humps. Thank you. Busting their humps to help with the campaign. But if we think that the labor movement is the 10 people or however many people occupy the offices at the OFL office, it's we're mistaken. The weakness in the labor movement exists in the form of all the affiliates and the lack of engagement at the grassroots level. And to be totally honest with you, I feel there's lots of really well-intentioned labor leaders who would love nothing more than to call the general strike. But there's a real fear. If 40% of unionized workers are voting for Ford, delivering on a general strike, that is a completely different question. And that means we have to have those hard questions. So I've had debates with people about whether we should be organizing around the slogan, to heck with Ford or Fraud Nation, or mocking and deriding people who voted for Ford. That was not the approach that we took. When we went into ridings where there's high levels of support for Doug Ford, we went in leading, not denouncing people, not Doug Ford's doing blah, blah, blah. What we led with was, would you like to sign this petition in support of a $15 minimum wage and paid sick days? And people, one after the other, of course I would, of course I would. Don't we have that already? Why is this in question? And then while they're signing, you get to have this incredible conversation about the big, the Chamber of Commerce and the big businesses, and they think they elected a friend in Doug Ford, and they're putting all this pressure on the new government, and we want you to help send a message to this government to side with us and not with the big business people. And in that process, we're taking people through their own educational experience, where it's almost you think he's going to defend us, I have a different opinion, but let's go test it out in practice. Let's go ask Doug Ford to stick up for us and see what happens. And in people's own experience, they're learning, and that's why our message was quite different right up to when they tabled Bill 47, where we're saying it's not too late, and yes, I think it's possible for Premier Ford to look at the evidence which shows that it doesn't harm the economy, and to look at the evidence that shows that 62% of small business owners actually support a $15 minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he has a chance to do the right thing. We sincerely wanted no barriers to this government doing the right thing, so that his base, the 42% of his voters, the 67% of voters who want paid sick days, who also voted for Doug Ford, so they themselves will conclude there was no reason why he couldn't have done the right thing by us, and they're going to learn the hard way that they may have made a mistake or that they may have been misled by this person. And that is a very radical thing, because those are the people who are outraged. And when I was in Etobicoke North 2 weekends ago, we collected 208 signatures in 90 minutes of people who were shocked, temp agency workers who were completely devastated to learn that the guy they voted for is cutting their equal pay for temp agency workers. That is an incredibly radical thing, but it means we have to pay attention on the left about how do we engage those workers, because if we just say, and I was actually recently in a panel where somebody said, I do think workers who voted for Doug Ford are stupid. If that is our starting point, we are sunk. We are absolutely sunk. So we need to lead on the issues. We have to recognize that 40 years of neoliberalism.
1 minute.
Thank you. I'll just conclude on this. 40 years of neoliberalism, and I'm a socialist too, I think, and this is not in any way a criticism. In fact, it's an expression of how important the work that we're doing as socialists is, but we don't have the same presence, socialist presence, that we had, that was present in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, where there was a real socialist imprint on the labor movement, and so there's an ideological weakness that we have to contend with, and we have low levels of class struggle in the form of strikes. That's not like just a denunciation to say objective conditions are difficult. It's to say that people lack the lived experience of strikes and the radicalization that accompanies that. And so those are all challenges that we have to face, and we need to knit those things together in a way that's going to be rebuilding those things, that's going to be rebuilding socialist analysis, that it's going to be reasserting a class consciousness that is not tinged with Stalinism, but a class consciousness that puts equity at the heart of it, that interrupts the kind of white supremacy that can accidentally invade our movements. If we do those things right and campaign on working class issues, my feeling is the objective conditions are very right, not just to build a strong working class movement, but to really put, as Elizabeth said at the beginning, but to engage people in socialist politics. But we have to get it right, and we can't take shortcuts, and I'm going to say ignore the top, because when we organize the grassroots, the leaders follow.
So hi, I'm a tenant advocate. I work for the Federation of Metro Tenants Association.
Use the microphone.
So you're going to have.
I'll use the microphone because,
Set this up here.
but you're going to start my time again.
No.
You might have to.
Pin it to your collar or just hold it.
I'll put it here. No, I
Can
can
you
put it
try
here.
speak into it?
Let me just make it a moment.
Bottom one is the, yeah. The white ones are the projects.
Yeah.
Hi.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi.
Great.
Fantastic.
Okay, hi.
Okay, we'll start again.
Okay, sorry the low voice. I'm tired. Yes, I'm a tenant advocate. I work for the Federation of Metro Tenants, and my work is to organize tenants. You can pass. As I prepared to talk here today, actually yesterday, I received the news that Doug Ford has brought down something I have fought very hard for. I and all the housing advocates, we have fought very hard for, that is rent control. As it is now, I think it was last year that we brought down the 1991 provision, what said that every building built after 1991 could have whatever rent the landlord decided to, whatever rent increase the landlord decided to put up. We brought it down after lots of fighting and whatever. Lobby is not my thing, but there was lobby involved. So the Liberals brought it in, Ford brought it down, whatever. Ford also defunded some youth programs and the youth advocate. That worries me because I am also the mother of a daughter who is now looking for an apartment, who has been in the street, who has been homeless, and who needs every support she can get from the government. So this is really really upsetting. So what I brought to show you guys is a PowerPoint I show tenants. The work I do is very grassroots, is very down there, really in the ground. Takes me a long time to get to higher politics with my tenants. As you guys can imagine, I deal with people that are very enlightened, to some people that are like, where on the day voters of Bob Ford, and they'll tell me, oh, Major Ford came to our building and now everything is going to be decided. You know, and that's what I show them. Can you go next? So this is what I show to my tenants, what you want as a tenant. And I don't know how many of you here are a tenant, but I am a tenant. This for me is reality. You can go next. What I do not want. So the most important things here that I don't want are an above guideline increase. Everybody knows what's an above guideline increase? An above guideline increase happens when your landlord comes to your building and says, oh, your balconies are not okay, they have to be redone, or something else, or the ceiling of the garage. And then he makes your life hell for about 3 or 4 years. He scaffolds your building. There's like all kinds of machines. Half of the people move out, and that's what the landlord wants, because then he can increase the rent.
Right.
And when it ends, he slaps you with an above guideline increase. An above guideline increase means that you're going to pay 15%, 16%, whatever percent over the guideline. So let's say the guideline in Ontario now is 1.8%. A landlord would make you pay 3% on top this year, so 4.8%, and next year more 3% on top of the guideline and the rent that has already been increased, and the next year more, and so and so. So it's like, as a tenant, nobody wants that. It is, my salary doesn't go up 5% a year, ever. It doesn't ever go. Why would my rent go? So that's something I don't want as a tenant. The other thing I don't want as a tenant is a renoviction. What is a renoviction? Renoviction is when your landlord comes to you and says, we need to reform your apartment, to renovate your apartment, and you have to move out. This is bullshit. They do that, it's illegal. People don't know that, and then people move out without knowing that there's a lot of things that they can get from the landlord before they move out. So other ways of renovation is making your life unlivable in your building. The laws for tenants are really poor in Ontario. Can you go? So what do I do to get more of the first and less or none of the later? Go ahead. Well, I get organized. So that's what I tell my tenants. You guys got to get organized. And my tenants will tell me, oh, but I'm going to be evicted. Oh, but retaliation. Oh, but what's going to happen? And then I tell them, it's very simple. I tell them, you know, you can fight and try something, or you can just lie down and let them keep stepping over you. Because that's what it is for tenants. You know, we are tenants of corporations. We are not even tenants of individuals, we're tenants of corporations. Once the landlord, the corporate landlord decides that they want something, they're so strong that if you don't get organized, you're screwed up. I know this is like a socialism or unionism 1.1, but that's what I do. Can you pass? So, yeah, we live in a society where capitalism tells you, take care of you, take care of your family, your clan, and screw the rest. And if I try to do something, then nobody will care. If I go to the landlord alone, he's not going to listen to me. You don't know what to do. I don't know my rights. I'm afraid of eviction. Can you go ahead? So you create a tenant association. That's what we do. We create tenant associations. I go to building, somebody calls me, he says, hey, we in our building are suffering, our landlord is doing so and so. I come there, I talk to them, I help them create a tenant association. And it's amazing. You can pass. So lots of amazing things happen when people get together to work. Next. So the ATN experience. The ATN, I brought papers to give to you, and I can give it later because I don't have a table to put. But 2 years ago, I started a thing with tenants that is a network of tenants. There is a landlord in Toronto called Julius. They are one of the most vicious landlords Toronto has ever seen. They come from Sweden. They are all around the world. They have all the same modus operandi, and they just screw tenants. They come to your building. First thing they do, they renovate your whole building. They get all the apartments. Every time somebody moves out, they go and they make a hell in the building. They bang, they destroy, they bring lots of noise, they cover the building until people start wanting to leave. The other thing is they take off the superintendent of the building, so you have nobody to complain to. They are very bad in maintenance. They make your life really hard. So I had about 10 different tenant associations I was working. They were all Achilles tenants. And I said, hey guys, let's start an Achilles tenants network. So this is the ATN. They formed in January last year. And I have been learning things with them. Can you get next? Yeah, so the things I learned with the ATN, it works together when there is a lot of people involved. Second, the mailing list. We created a simple thing, a group, a mailing group for the ATN, where somebody goes there and says, hey, my landlord is telling me that we have to open the door for a fire inspection, a mandatory fire inspection. Then other tenant will say, hey, your landlord cannot say that, only the fire department can say that. And then something is learned there. So next thing that tenant says, well, we didn't let our landlord do it. And they have to send us letters of apology. So that's what happens when everybody, all those tenants get together and start doing something together. Next. Well, I'm not going to go through all of this. It's just we need to get together and understand our neighbors and build community to help to get the things to happen. Next. Next. All the things that you can do. But the first thing you do is you talk to others. As a worker, you talk to other workers. As a tenant, you talk to other tenants. It's interesting because you start getting people that are you start getting people that are very afraid or very not wanting to be active. They get educated. You educate your neighbors, you educate the people that are around you, they educate others, and you work together. And you build community, and you get to know everybody in your building, and everybody wins. Okay, next. Next. Be a source of education. You can once you learn, you can teach others, and you can bring people, just like we're doing here. Next. You talk to your elected representatives and you push them. Some of them, I work with some city councilors and some MPPs that really help the tenant cause. So those guys are great, but even if they are not, you go there and you stick it to them. So that's one thing. And next, that's just an example. like a counselor I work with, Matlow, they call and accuse about their behavior with tenants, and many times there was response. So next, and yeah. So you don't be a stranger. So why did I present you this very basic, this very simple thing? Because this is how we start things. We start things there. There, I at least start things there. They're on the ground, they're on the floor, where people are very small, are not politicized, don't know shit of shit. No, when I was in the school, I was in university, the dream of my life was learn to speak political. I wanted to say, comrades, blah, 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 blah. I wanted to do that. My colleagues did that. I wanted to be like that. But today, I know that you can say that sometimes in very small ways. You know, you can contribute in a very small way. You can bring that change. You know, and I am about it. Is my time gone? No, is the FMTA I work for is about that. We work to bring for tenants' rights, but when you work for tenants' rights, you start seeing, I see my tenants for the ATN, the Achilles Tenant Network, I see that now they come to other tenants in the mailing list and they say, hey, what about the $15 salary? This is happening. This is affecting housing. You know, people start connecting those things, and well, this is how I do that. I'm here to hear how others do that.
Great.
Comrade Barry?
Comrades and friends, a number of us were at a rally for the postal workers on Wednesday afternoon, and these postal workers are engaged in rotating strikes across the country, and they had a chant which is very familiar to you. I ask you to join me. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. And there should be no peace without justice, and we see many of the building blocks of the campaigns that we need to wage. With breathtaking speed, the Doug Ford Conservatives unleashed the demons of war on the working class of Ontario. And Ford's bombastic claim that he is for the people is collapsing like his cabinet is collapsing, like his opinion poll numbers are collapsing. And fully exposed is a government for the rich people, led by a greedy, manipulative bully who inherited his millions, a man that we call Thug Ford. The response to Ford's agenda by the NDP official opposition and its Labour allies has been quite underwhelming. On June the 16th, the OFL held a protest outside the Ministry of Labour. About 1,000 people attended. The Toronto Pride Parade did not address the Tory victory. Subsequently, public meetings hosted by Briar Patch Magazine, by Workers' Action Centre, and the Socialist Project presented what was essentially a gloomy outlook, stressing Labour's retreat over the years, its lack of capacity to deal with the situation. During the summer, Labour Council leaders talked about the need to resist Ford's agenda, but they dismissed any thought of reviving the days of action of 23 years ago. Several rallies took place at City Hall in July and August, I'm sure many of you attended, to oppose Ford's plan to shrink Toronto City Council. But none of those protests projected an alliance with Labour, much less mass job action. The Labour Day Parade, which ended at Lamport Stadium because of the lockout of IATSE at Exhibition Place, likewise did not address the need for a common front to stop Ford. And by the way, the IATSE sisters and brothers have reached a settlement with the city and Exhibition Place, so I'm looking forward to going to some Toronto Marlies hockey games at the Coliseum. But to his credit, Sid Ryan, the former OFL president who was hounded from office by Conservative Labour leaders, called for a common front. And he did this again at the relaunch of the Workers' Action Movement at a conference about 3 weeks ago. for the NDP, the highlight was Andrea Horwath leading an NDP MP's walkout from the legislature over Bill 5. OCAP staged a protest to highlight the housing crisis. The Ontario Health Coalition, backed by Unifor, rallied over 1,000 people, mostly retirees, in front of the legislature on October the 23rd to oppose spending cuts and privatization. The next day, about 400 were outside the Ministry of Labour to say, hands off Bill 148. John Clark wrote recently, and I want to quote this, a couple of paragraphs. Doug Ford is not going to be swayed by moral appeals and restrained protests. He will forge ahead unless he meets a resistance he is forced to reckon with. The resistance means economic disruption and defiant social mobilization on a scale he doesn't have enough cops to contain. The political strike must be a central part of this. Unions are some of the only progressive organizations with the power to bring production to a halt and to stop the flow of goods and services. I doubt that a majority of union leaders, John goes on to say, in Ontario will welcome this perspective. So it's necessary to begin at the base and taking action. Union activists need to start organizing, building alliances, and taking action with a view to creating a critical mass of active resistance that can impact how unions react to the Tory attack. Ontario has become a testing ground for hyper-austerity at the hands of a political buffoon. In the months ahead, we can create an inspiring model of effective resistance, but for this to happen, the power of organized labor must be unchained. Close quote. Well, Socialist Action shares that view, precisely. We began in June to circulate the resolution for an emergency OFL convention, which Julius drew to your attention moments ago. Its purpose is to promote escalating actions to stop Ford. There is growing support for this resolution, as Julius mentioned. The task now is to enlist more support, because this is how we begin the conversation with people about what to do in this situation. Now, the Toronto municipal election was a major missed opportunity for the workers' movement. The NDP didn't field a slate of candidates. It hasn't done that for decades. Toronto Labour Council and the fake left Progress Toronto outfit backed so-called progressives. And who were they? A motley crew of independent Liberals and NDPers headed by Liberal Jennifer Keesmaat for mayor. Not a socialist among them. By obscuring class politics, they handed John Tory a victory without a fight. Instead of contesting his agenda, they blurred our vision and they made it easier for Doug Ford to escalate his attacks on us. Workers face obstacles both inside and outside of our class organizations. So what are we to do? Well, let's begin by taking stock of the left. There are about a dozen political organizations on the radical left, and they consist of workers, employed and underemployed, white-collar professionals, intellectuals, students. It is admittedly a pretty small base. What about the mainstream workers' organizations? This is where the task really comes into focus. Labor unions, despite their oftentimes conservative leaders, are considered part of the left because the objective interests of the union members put them at odds with the profit maximization goals of the capitalist system and its state. Unions are undeniably working class. But what about a party like the NDP, which was founded by a merger of the CCF and the Canadian Labour Congress in 1961? NDP policies often fail to uphold even the most basic class interests of workers. For example, in the 2014 provincial election, NDP leader Andrea Horwath refused to support the demand for a $14 an hour minimum wage. Like then federal NDP leader Tom Mulcair, she pledged a balanced budget without big tax increases on the rich. So what makes the NDP a workers' party? Well, its composition does. Not just the class composition of its membership, but the organic connection of the party to the unions. In many ways, unions call the shots in the NDP. Look at the NDP Ontario Constitution. Article 4 states, quote, affiliated membership shall be open to trade unions farm organizations, cooperatives, ethnic associations, women's, men's organizations, and other appropriate organizations, close quote. Section 7 of the Constitution, ONDP, states that delegates at conventions shall include all members of the Provincial Council, delegates from constituency associations, and delegates from affiliated unions, one for each 300 members. The Provincial Council, what's that? It's a mini convention of the party held 3 times a year. It includes delegates from affiliated union locals or groupings of affiliated unions, plus 1 delegate from the Ontario Federation of Labour and 1 delegate from each and every Labour Council in the province. So, my conclusion about this look at the NDP and its composition. At the end of the day, 33% of ONDP provincial executive, 35% of the Provincial Council, and up to 40% of provincial conventions of the NDP are made up of delegates from labor unions. And that does not count the number of district association, youth, ethnic, and women's committee delegates who are also members of unions. Clearly, the composition of the NDP is overwhelmingly working class. This is true in spite of its policies, which are right-wing social democratic and liberal capitalist in nature. Now, why do most NDP and union leaders resist mass action and embrace pro-capitalist policies? Well, their allergy to class struggle is only partly due to a misunderstanding of history. It's largely due to the phenomenon of what we Marxists call bureaucracy. And that's not a drawer full of folders. That's something else that is a sociological reality. What is bureaucracy? Marxist economist Ernest Mandel, among others, famously explained that the origins of the labor bureaucracy are in the episodic and discontinuous character of working class struggle under capitalism. The entire working class cannot be permanently active in the class struggle. Workers must sell our labor power to survive, and thus we can only engage in mass struggles as a class, as a whole class, in extraordinary revolutionary or pre-revolutionary situations, which, because of the structural position of wage labor under capitalism, must be of a short duration. In the wake of successful mass struggles, only a minority of the workers remain consistently active. You could call that layer a vanguard layer. Most of the workers' vanguard continues in the class war. It preserves and it transmits to newer workers the traditions of mass struggle in the community and in the workplace.
5 minutes.
However, a minority of this militant minority, together with middle-class intellectuals who have access to cultural skills from which the bulk of the working class is excluded, must take on responsibility for administering the unions or political parties created by upsurges of mass activity. The continuation of mass political or trade union organizations is inconceivable without an apparatus of full-time functionaries. Those workers who become officials of the unions and political parties begin to experience conditions of life that are very different from those who remain in the workplace. The new officials find themselves freed from the daily humiliations of the capitalist labor process. They are no longer subject to alienated labor or to the petty despotism of supervisors. They are able to set their own hours and devote the bulk of their waking hours to fighting for the workers, in quotation marks. The officials seek to consolidate these privileges and to create new ones. In particular, they seek higher incomes, substantially higher than those of the workers they purportedly represent. In defense of their privileges, the labor bureaucracy excludes rank-and-file activists from any real decision-making power. The bureaucracy sees the preservation of the union or party apparatus as an end in itself. It becomes the main objective of the labor bureaucracy. The labor bureaucrats seek to contain working-class militancy within boundaries that do not threaten the continued existence of the institutions which are the basis of the officials' unique lifestyle. Thus, the dialectic of partial conquests, the possibility that new struggles may result in the destruction of the mass organizations of the working class, tends to reinforce, to buttress the labor bureaucracy's reliance on election campaigns and on parliamentary pressure tactics, what they lovingly call lobbying, to win political reforms. They rely on strictly regimented collective bargaining to increase wages and improve working conditions. Any attempt to promote the self-activity and self-organization of working and oppressed people in forms of militant workplace actions, mass political strikes or the like, must be quashed. At this point, the bureaucracy's organizational fetishism, giving priority to the survival of the apparatus over new advances in the struggle, grows into a substitutionism that demands the workers' unquestioning obedience to leaders who claim they know, quote, what is best for the workers. This tendency towards bureaucratic control can be counteracted by enforcing the principles of the Paris Commune. And you can ask me about that and I can elaborate on those. So here's the question that I put to everyone in this room here and now. Do you want the working class to challenge and reverse the corporate agenda?
Yes.
Do you? Yes. Do you really?
Yes.
Then you must contend with the present leadership of the unions and the NDP. You must expose those misleaders in front of their members and win those workers to a workers' agenda. The path forward is the path of struggle. Struggle must be linked to a program of concrete anti-capitalist demands. Tax big business, shorten the work week without a cut in pay and benefits, expropriate and invest the interests of big oil and gas for a rapid conversion to green energy, create housing and jobs for all. We call these transitional demands. Social Democrats and liberals love to ridicule proposals for mass action. They point to decades of retreat and passivity, to which they have contributed mightily by concessions bargaining and by curtailing union democracy. So how do we go forward? It takes more than slogans. A general strike does not materialize out of thin air. It must be built from concrete grievances, out of utilizing the methods of political agitation and local organization. It begins with workers who fight for mass action inside their class organizations. It begins with socialists who are prepared to confront all obstacles on the path of struggle, including the present union and NDP leaders. How do we know this will work? Because that is how students in Quebec defeated union tuition increases in 2012. Because that is how Jeremy Corbyn captured and retained the leadership of the British Labour Party. Because that is how we stopped Prime Minister Frache from joining the Gulf War in 1991. Because that is how we pushed back against Mike Harris with 11 days of action, general strikes in 11 cities 23 years ago. Because that is how postal workers won paid maternity leave in 1981, and how they are striking to win equal pay in postal banking today. When 40,000 high school students across Ontario walked out to demand modern sex ed and pro-Indigenous curriculum, they showed the way. $15 in fairness shows the way. OCAP, Metro Tenants, rent strikers in Parkdale and Hamilton, no one is illegal, Black Lives Matter, Queer Ontario, Idle No More, opponents of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, they all show the way forward. So the lesson is clear, and I say this in conclusion, we can win if we struggle. So to the official leaders, we say, lead. Yes, we say to them, lead, or follow, or get out of the way, so we can take this struggle forward. To remake the world, we must first remake the workers' movement, waging the battle against capitalist austerity as we go along. Socialist Action is committed to that course, and we have a plan to achieve it. The stakes are high, the time is short, to make real change sooner than later, the best thing that you can do is to join Socialist Action. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. Right on.